Alright, I'm back with my fancy new eyes, so let's talk about Transformers. Now, I know a lot of people have taken time to rip into these films and compare them, and yeah, they suck. We get it. My question is, why did we expect them to be good? So, why did we expect them to be any good? I want to clarify where I'm going with this. I'm not really interested in sitting here and complaining about how bad the new movies are, or claiming that Michael Bay is Buzz Bunny.
And I'll sodomize your childhood like the little bitch you are, because I'm extreme!
There's a lot of movies coming out these days that all suffer from the same bad scripting decisions, and I'm sure I'll get around to talking about that trend sooner or later. But for right now, what I'm interested in is a quirk that comes up specifically with Transformers, more so than a lot of other properties, and it's more than just nostalgia.
I'll rip out your optics!
You got the power!
But it's also nostalgia, so let's talk about that too. Nostalgia as a term was coined in 1688 by Johannes Hofer, a Swiss doctor, to describe the kind of homesickness reported among Swiss mercenaries fighting in Italy and France. What they were experiencing was a form of depression that we'd probably call culture shock today, as they'd leave their mountainous homes for the lowland plains of Italy and France. The foreign landscape combined with the harsh living arrangements led many soldiers to become despondent and fixated on the way things were back home. No real surprise there. In response to this, their superior officers banned the performance of Kurai Hen, a traditional Swiss melody that you're probably pretty familiar with. Through the 1700s and 1800s, the definition of nostalgia as a specific medical condition waned, but the word hung around as the Romantic movement of the early 1800s latched onto the concept. They loved the poetic notion of soldiers pining for the pastoral simplicity of their home back in the mountains, playing their folk songs. And thus the modern concept of nostalgia was born, a looking back to the past as a better, simpler time. This concept is often paired with the notion of Götterdämmerung, or the twilight of the gods, the notion that the present is in decline, a less pure, less advanced, less good version of the past. In the past, gods walked among men and there were real heroes, and it was a golden age for comics and television and industry and philosophy and art and everything else that I think is awesome. The cause of this perception is a bunch of filters that the brain has in place for how memories are stored and retrieved. In a lot of ways, memory is like a photo album. You don't take a lot of photos of funerals, bad days, arguments, or the crushing monotony of day-to-day living. You take photos of parties, weddings, birthdays, graduations, and reunions. When it comes to remembering the past, we typically remember the good parts version of it. This is doubly true with culture because we tend to forget or marginalize the crap, even if it was incredibly popular in the moment.
Who wants to know?
This is where Transformers comes into the picture. Looking back at the show in the 1986 movie, it's just not very good. I know that saying that on the internet borders on treason, but it's true. The story doesn't make much sense, the characters have no personality, the pacing is touch and go, and they made some really, really weird decisions. In fact, a lot of those same criticisms can be leveled at the new films as well. There's little to distinguish one Transformer from another, and they don't so much have personalities as they just have a role to fill. That one's a sports car, this one's a dump truck, that guy's a jet. It makes sense that we remember the good parts version of the past, idealizing things that we grew up with, even remembering them as being better than they actually were. But what's the good parts version here? Let me tell you, it's the toys.
Introducing Blaster. He looks like an innocent radio, but transformed, he's the powerful Autobot communicator.
Up there is Private Blaster! Watch out for Soundwave! It's Soundwave and Buzzsaw! Blaster and Prime will stop them!
The Transformers, each sold separately from Hasbro.
This is the second point I wanted to make, and the one that's specific to Transformers more so than even the other hyper-marketable cartoons of the era, like Thundercats or He-Man, and that self-constructed narrative. While a lot of the cartoons from the early 80s existed to sell toys, few of them were quite as shameless as Transformers. The characters are basically devoid of personality, being defined more by their look and form than anything else. In a lot of ways, the Autobots and Decepticons are ciphers, or tabula rasa, blank slate. There's enough information there to get started, but everything else is empty space. This goes down even into the character design, which is what sets it apart from its peers whose characters were generally humans, or humans with pointy ears. The large blocky robot designs are just humanoid enough for sympathetic anthropomorphization and operate only at the lowest levels of design personality correlation, and even then just barely.
You've got mail.
Dear foldable human, what the hell is sympomorphic anthrohumanization? Alright, I'll slow down. Sympomorphic anthrohumanization, also called sympathetic anthropomorphization, is really just a big fancy phrase that means making something look more like a human so that the audience will project human emotions onto it. It's pretty standard practice in animation, and there's a whole different degree from really little things like adding more human eyes to an otherwise normal looking animal, like in Fox and the Hound, or completely restructuring the face, like in Finding Nemo. Or you could just watch this Simpsons clip to understand the contrast.
But Marge, look at the little guy.
The idea behind anthropomorphization is that the audience has an easier time connecting with things that look more like themselves, and this breaks out into a hierarchy of things that we care for. We care more for our immediate family than we do for strangers, and we care more for other mammals than we do for reptiles, and more for reptiles than birds, and more for birds than fish, and more for fish than insects. Basically, the less human something looks, the harder it is for us to care about it, and the easier it is to vilify it. If you want your villains to be easier to dislike, then give them reptilian or insectoid features. This is why Ursula the Sea Witch is half octopus. The merfolk are already fairly alien, but octopuses are even more alien in contrast. This folds into design personality correlation, which is typically expressed in the little things, like giving Jafar from Aladdin close-set narrow eyes and harsh angular features, but giving the Sultan round baby-like features. It also carries over expectations that we bring with us from our own associations, like how Optimus Prime, being a big truck, is probably tough, strong, and a blue-collar sort of down-to-earth guy. On a really simple level, the rules of design personality correlation work off our most basic assumptions, like strong things should be big and stocky, while fast things should be small or thin, and bigger equals more powerful. In fact, a couple weeks ago in Brain Candy, we talked about how absurdist humor involves intentionally violating the audience's suspension of disbelief.
'Tis but a scratch.
Well, suspension of disbelief also extends directly from our assumptions and expectations, which is why the noisy cricket from Men in Black is such a successful absurdist joke. We expect small guns to be weak guns.
Noisy cricket.
Actually, this size-power relationship is one of the few assumptions that Transformers regularly sticks with. Most of the characters share very similar silhouettes in their humanoid form, with only the most important characters being significantly larger than the others. The rest of the character is made up of what they turn into, and really, that's about all there is to the Transformers' personalities. A rough human silhouette, bigger robots are more powerful robots, and association with whatever real-world thing they turn into. What steps in to fill the gap is self-constructed narrative. When you're playing with a toy, you project your own expectations and assumptions onto the toy and create your own story. Even if you don't consciously plot out each character's arc and motivations and flaws, when you have an Optimus Prime in one hand and a Megatron in the other, your brain fills in all of the gaps you personally need in order to create a fulfilling narrative. It's not that Michael Bay's Transformers failed to live up to the legacy and expectations of the original shows or movies. They failed to live up to the expectations of our imaginations, stories and characters that we'd invented while playing with toys. I mean, that makes sense. Nothing is really going to live up to the world that you create in your head. Granted, there's a host of other structural problems with the films, but it's pretty telling that despite the outcry from fans, they're still raking in the cash. People are seeing these films. Now, before I sign off with this, I do want to talk about a specific point where the new films go off track. Think back to earlier, the part about Ursula the Sea Witch. The merfolk are already fairly alien compared with the human characters, so they had to make them more human by contrasting them with Ursula, who is distinctly more alien. Our ability to successfully anthropomorphize something depends heavily on what it's compared to or contrasted against. In the new films, they undercut our ability to connect with the Transformers themselves on an emotional level by spending the majority of the screen time focusing on Sam Witwicky and the other human characters. As a result, the Transformers themselves all just fall into a big pool of sameness. Even with a weak human character to compare them to, the human is still a real human and forms the baseline for our expectations, preventing our brains from filling in those blank spaces that was so easy to fill in with the toys. Think about other films that pair a human character with something functionally alien. Successful ones, like E.T. and the Iron Giant, spend a lot of time and effort crafting the relationship to make sure that the outsider emotes well enough on its own that the audience will accept it as an emotional entity. Even then, it's still really easy to screw up, and then you either wind up with a Wilson the volleyball situation where half the audience buys it and half thinks it's stupid, or you end up with something worse.
My friend might have been banished.
Transformers!